Okay. Should we start?
Yeah, I think we can start and start with the introduction. So, hello and welcome everybody to our event. This is Lucy and I'm Lisa, and we are both from the Initiative Dessauer Ufer in Hamburg. And we are very happy to talk to Helen Epstein tonight. Helen is a Czech American author and journalist who lives in Boston in the United States. And Lucy will introduce her in a few more words in a few minutes. But first of all, I wanted to introduce also the place we are at and the reason why we're meeting today, which is because Helen edited and published her mother's war memoir called Franci's War last year. And this memoir takes place in part in Hamburg. And our group, the Initiative Dessauer Ufer, is aiming to build a memorial at Lagerhaus at Dessauer Ufer in the harbor of Hamburg. And the Lagerhaus is an old warehouse built in 1903, 1907, which was used during the last year of the Second World War as a satellite camp of Neuengammer concentration camp. Neuengammer is close to Hamburg, or belongs to Hamburg. And Helen's mother, Franci, was imprisoned there between July and September 1944 in a group of 1,500 women who were persecuted as Jewish. And you can see Helen and Franci in the picture behind us, which is also the picture we used to advertise this event tonight. But before we start to learn more about the two of them and the book, I will just tell you some quick technical things. Your cameras are turned off and your mics as well, so we can't see you, but you're welcome to ask questions in the chat at any time. But there will be a set time for discussion questions later, so maybe save those for later. And before we do that, Lucy and I have prepared some questions we want to talk about with Helen, and Helen will read us a chapter from her mother's book. And when the time for the discussion comes, you can also ask in German if you're more comfortable doing that. And I'll be happy to translate the questions for you. Yes, and we're sitting here in the Freiraum of the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg. Freiraum means like it's an open space, it's a free space within a big museum in Hamburg, which is open to the public. Everyone can come and spend time here. And our group, the Initiative Dessauer Ufer, is currently doing like an open lab here where we are exhibiting our research findings about the history of Lagerhaus and where we are trying to discuss the future of the building with the general public in Hamburg. So thank you very much to the people from Freiraum for giving us the opportunity to be here tonight. And obviously, thank you very much for Helen for taking the time to join us tonight. And thanks to everyone who decided to listen in. And now Lucy will say a few more words about Helen.
Okay, yes, I will introduce Helen Epstein a bit more in detail to the people in the Zoom. First, Helen, hello also from me, and thank you for joining us tonight in this digital space. Remembrance work has increasingly taken place digitally since the pandemic, and also we as a group, as an initiative, moved a lot of our work online. And this is how we met you, Helen, because you wrote us on Facebook. Helen saw that we are doing research on Dessauer Ufer, and she has just last year edited and published her mother's book, Franci's War, and as Lisa said, this book takes place in part in Hamburg at satellite camp Dessauer Ufer. And yeah, this war memoir is a very special book. We really recommend to read it. And also for us researching Dessauer Ufer, it's a very important source. But Helen is not only the editor and publisher of her mother's book, but also wrote 10 books herself. And several of them were also translated in German. And one book that is translated in German that Helen wrote in the 70s is a very important book, I think also a well-known book, Children of the Holocaust. The German title is Die Kinder des Holocaust, and in this book, Helen writes about the children of survivors, the so-called second generation, and the transmission of intergenerational trauma and history. And another book that is translated in German is Where She Came From, and the German title is Dreifach heimatlos, die Suche einer Tochter nach der verlorenen Welt ihrer Mutter. And to write this book, Helen used her mother's war memoir as a source material. So all these books are connected, and also tonight we want to talk about Franci and Franci's story and her war memoir, but also about you, Helen, and about your work and your story. So thank you again for coming. Yeah.
And regarding this, I have the first question for you. So you started writing Children of the Holocaust over 50 years ago when you yourself were a student. And for this book, you met many children of survivors like yourself and talked to them. So I have 2 or 3 questions about this book before we'll start getting into your mother's memoir. And can you maybe, first of all, tell us what led to you writing this book? What was your motivation?
Well, good evening, first of all, and thank you very, very much for having me. I don't understand what's going on with my background. It looks like it's not really doing the right thing, but let's try and ignore it. So I was a student in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. I was about your age, and I was meeting all kinds of students from all over the world who were all, it turned out, children of Holocaust survivors. And I felt really comfortable with them in a way that I didn't feel with Americans. And I wondered why. And so I started talking to them about their families and their backgrounds. And it turned out they all had backgrounds similar to mine. I noticed they all spoke 2 or 3 languages. They spoke the language of their culture in which they were living currently. And they also spoke the language that historically their family had spoken. So in my family at home, we spoke Czech, but of course, in the world of my childhood and my high school, we spoke English. I met a Hungarian Jew from Brazil. I met a Polish Jew from Belgium. And I started understanding that this was a group in itself. I became a journalist in 1968 very dramatically because I was caught in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. I was born in Prague, but I didn't return to Prague until I was a student, until I was 20 years old. And then I was caught in the Soviet invasion. And because I couldn't go outside, I was staying with people who were very worried about my being safe. I found a typewriter and I wrote an article about what it was like to be caught in the Soviet invasion. And that article was published in the Jerusalem Post. And so I became an instant journalist, and I've been writing ever since. And one of the subjects I wanted to write a book about ever since the beginning was about the second generation.
And yeah, that's a really exciting story. I can very much understand, very dramatic. And when I was starting to read Children of the Holocaust, I was really impressed by how many children of survivors you met, and was just wondering, like, what was it like for you to speak to so many descendants of survivors?
Well, one of the great things about being a journalist is when you publish for a large newspaper, you get tremendous numbers of responses. And I was very lucky because I'm a New Yorker, and one of the first places that I worked for after I returned to New York from Israel was I worked for the New York Times. And I wrote an article about children of survivors for the Sunday New York Times. I'm sure there's a comparable newspaper in Germany if you wrote for the Sunday edition. And after I wrote this article, I received over 500 single-spaced typed responses from people. So as scholars, the two of you know that it's just an amazing situation because my research came to me. Literally, I received letters that were 10 pages long, full of information. I also, by the way, received letters from children of Nazis, from children of the Armenian genocide. And all of this was fantastic for my book because I had all of this research. But in addition to the letters from people I did not know, I, of course, interviewed many people in person. And those were amazing experiences. They were very much like, I don't know if you have this in Germany, but in the 1970s, there were women's consciousness raising groups. And so this was something like that. This was consciousness raising for the second generation.
Yeah, I believe that. And that also leads to my last question. Can you tell us about how this first book of yours, Children of the Holocaust, how did that affect your life?
Oh, it completely changed my life. My mother didn't want me to write the book because she thought that if I wrote this book, nobody would ever pay attention to anything else I wrote. I was really an arts reporter. I wrote about musicians, I wrote about theater, I wrote about the visual arts. And my book that you can see in the back, Music Talks, actually was translated into German. I think it's called Die musikalische Rundfunk, or Der musikalische Rundfunk. And so that's what I did mostly. So writing Children of the Holocaust, my mother was right. It did change my life in that everyone always associates me with that book instead of with arts journalism or anything else I write. But it also changed the lives of many other people because I was fortunate. I lived in New York City. I had lots of other second generation members around me, but there were many people all over the world who really could not speak about being second generation in public. They felt afraid. For example, second generation members in Prague have told me that it was very dangerous to talk about this under the Soviet influenced regime. And in Germany, the situation was also different. Even in Israel, the situation was quite different because Holocaust survivors were marginalized in Israeli society during the 50s and 60s. So it was an incredibly significant book in ways that I did not anticipate. I only discovered afterwards how important it was. So, but my mother was right. Everybody always associates me first with that book.
That's true.
Yeah, thank you. You already mentioned your mother didn't want you to write, to publish your book. Now we would switch to your mother's book, which she also wrote in the 70s. And yeah, you published it last year in 2020, and your mother wrote it in 1974. And when I heard these dates for the first time, I had two questions, like why wasn't it published back in the 70s, and why did you decide to publish it now? But let's start with the first question. Do you know, or do you have any idea why your mother's book was not published in the 70s, even though she tried to publish it and she wanted it to be published?
I think it wasn't published because, first of all, the publishing industry in 1970s was very male. I think it's difficult for the two of you to imagine how male it was. I was hired as a journalism professor in 1974, and I was one of the first women journalism professors in my department. I was the first professor in my department to get tenure. And I was hired in 1974. At the time, there were maybe 6% of women professors in a university. And my university was a very liberal university. It was New York University, very big. I think it was then the largest private university in the United States, and they only had 6% women. I don't know what the figure is for the publishing industry in 1974, but I know that there was very, very low representation of women. So first of all, the professional status of women. Secondly, within Jewish culture, traditionally, women are supposed to be quiet, modest, not to raise their voice, not to call attention to themselves, certainly not to give a Zoom interview. And in 1970, the prototype of the American Jewish woman was very much more the traditional Jewish woman. And I think my mother was not a traditional Jewish woman. She was very outspoken. She was not religious. She was baptized at birth. Her name on her birth certificate is Francisca Margot Paulina Rabinek. Now, her last name, Rabinek, means little rabbi in Czech, but nonetheless, she was baptized. So I think American publishers simply did not see her as a prototype of a Jew. On top of that, she was extremely candid about love and sex and sexuality. And at the time, again, this is very difficult for you to understand because in your time, sex is a matter of public discussion. But back in 1974, when she was writing this, nobody talked about sexual intercourse on social media, not on radio, not on television. In the movies, sex meant a kiss, not even usually on the mouth, usually on the cheek. And American society is quite puritanical. At least it was about sexual matters. So I think the combination of all of these things made her book difficult to publish. Also, she was not a literary person. She was a dress designer. And she did not have strong literary aspirations. Maybe another person would have tried harder to get it published, but she thought, oh, my daughter is a writer. She can use it. She can tell my story. Mm-hmm. So how did you want to know why was it published now? Now that's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I received an email from a stranger in Berlin. Now, you know, again, you take email and the internet for granted. In my time, when I was your age, there was no internet. Nobody, if somebody wanted to write to me, it took months before they read something that I wrote, and then the email, the letter came. So 2 years ago, I got an email from a man in Berlin who wrote, in your book, Dreifach Heimatlos, you say that your mother was in prison in Prague in 1939 with a woman who was my father's first wife. And I think this is wrong. She was not in prison in 1939. And can you show me where you got this material? So I, of course, being a good journalist, I went back to my mother's manuscript. And I found the pages where she describes being in Pankrat's prison in Prague with this man's father's first wife. It's 3 pages. And I scanned them and I sent them to him. And he said, thank you. And that was the end of my relationship with him. But it began my relationship with the manuscript. I started reading the manuscript again after a long time, since I hadn't looked at it since 1997, I think. And I read it and I thought, this is really, really good source material. And my first impulse was to make it available to scholars. And I thought, who would be most interested in this? And I thought, well, I'll send it to Prague because there's so much about Prague and the Czech situation. And so I sent it to people in Prague and to scholars, women's history scholars, Holocaust history scholars, and Jewish history scholars. And they all said, this is fantastic, but we think you should make it available commercially. So I sent it to an agent in Prague, and she said, oh yes, everybody will want to read this. And the first publishing house that bought it was actually a Slovak publishing house, and the second house was a Czech publishing house. The Czech publishing house went bankrupt immediately, but it is being published next week in Prague in hardcover. And it's called Francina Válka, for those if anyone's listening in Czech or has Czech friends. So it's going to be published next week in Prague. But it was the second publishing house that bought it. And then I was still thinking mostly scholars would be interested in this, but then an American publishing house bought it, a very good one, Penguin US, and then Penguin UK bought it. And now it has been published in 9 countries. So I'm very excited about it. The countries include Russia and Portugal and Italy, of course.
And it's translated, I think, in 7 languages, but not into German yet.
Not into German yet, and I'm hoping that a German publisher will look at it and publish it.
Yeah, we also do hope that. Okay.
So now you've already told us a bit about the book, so we're all excited to hear the excerpt, which you will read very soon.
Okay.
But before that, maybe it would be good if we could learn a bit more about your mother and her story.
Okay.
So she, if you want to, obviously, but what we know is that she was born in Prague in 1920. So she was 19 years old when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about how your mother grew up, what her life was like before the Nazis came to Czechoslovakia?
So my mother was a city girl, a Prague girl. She was born in Prague in 1920. She was very identified as a Czech citizen. Remember, the first Czechoslovak Republic was founded in 1918. And so she was very identified with this new country, this new nation. And Prague was an extremely cosmopolitan place in the 20s and 30s. There were many refugees there from all over. There were refugees from the Russian Revolution. There were refugees from Germany. There were Americans living there. There were British people living there. It was very, very, very cosmopolitan, a bit like Berlin is today. And she grew up there. Her parents spoke German. Her nanny spoke Czech. And she was sent to a French school. So by the time she was 10 years old, she was fluent in 3 languages. And she loved American movies, and so she learned English very quickly. She was a high school dropout. She was going to the French lycée, and she decided she didn't want to go to the academic route. She wanted to be a dress designer, and she studied design. And her mother had a dress salon right in the center of Prague. And so she could apprentice to her mother, and she went with her mother every year to fashion shows in Berlin and in Paris. And she really had a passion for fashion, not like me. I have no passion for fashion whatsoever, but she really loved fashion. And that's what she was doing when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia. She had a very mixed clientele. She and her mother ran the salon together. By the time she was 18, she was on the papers as the official director of the salon. And their clientele included Germans, Czechs, Jews, and foreigners in Prague. And that was very important because some of the Czech clients saved my mother's photographs and papers and some of her possessions while she was in the camps. So my mother was forced to not to sell, but to essentially give the salon away during the process of Aryanization after the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. And so she worked there secretly for a while. And then she was deported first with her parents to Theresienstadt. And then from Theresienstadt, she was deported to Auschwitz. And then from Auschwitz, she was deported with 500 other Czech Jewish women to Hamburg. And that's the chapter that I'm going to read to you from. It's a very, very interesting chapter, I think, both for scholars and for general readers. And I think you'll see why. It's very much focused on women. It's very much focused on practical things. And I think it also shows my mother's eye as a dress designer. She notices details like what people are wearing and what they're doing, and the relationships between women and men. And I guess I should also point out that because she was a dress designer, my mother was very accustomed to hearing intimate details of women's lives. You know how, I don't know, I suppose it's the same in Germany, that women talk a lot to their hairdressers and tell them all their secrets. Well, the same is true of women and their dressmakers. And so my mother, by the time she was 18, had heard absolutely every kind of intimate relationship that there is. And so nothing that she saw in the camps shocked her particularly. So this is how she begins. I think it's chapter 20. A very strange scene awaited the travelers when the train from Auschwitz finally reached Hamburg. This is July of 1944. The train stopped in front of a dark row of buildings, 3 stories high, with huge sliding doors. Young men wearing unfamiliar uniforms without insignia were laughing and shouting all at the same time, delighted by the arrival of a trainload of young women. The ladies were puzzled, then smiled back and waved. Car after car was unloaded under the supervision of an extremely handsome and elegant SS Hauptscharführer, who was instantly christened Petrovich after a popular German movie star. The women were divided into 2 groups and sent up into what had been a warehouse with loading facilities on both sides. One side of the building faced the tracks, and the other side was directly on the water. Inside the warehouse were rows of bunks arranged in blocks of 6. On the track side was a low sink with many water faucets in the center and a partitioned corner reserved for the capo. Some of the women dashed to the opposite windows to stake out claims to a row of bunks. Some climbed on a bench to look out. The boys next door, having had the same idea, were already crowding the windows. There were some language problems, since all of them were Italians, but some spoke French or broken German. Meanwhile, other young women started spraying each other from the faucet on top of the sink, naked and oblivious to Petrovich and a group of guards. As they became aware of the men's stares, the girls disappeared into the bunks until only Silva was standing on top of the sink like a marble nymph. Chuckling, Petrovich ordered her down and to the commando quarters 2 floors below. One can only guess at what happened there, but Silva did not seem to be upset by the episode and did not look maltreated on her return. The Italians had abandoned their positions at the windows when they heard the guards, but returned when it turned dark. Unfortunately, there was only one window that was close enough to enable conversation, which led to fights about whose turn and for how long. The group nearest to the window established a monopoly, doling out space and time as special favors. A tall blonde man in the Italian house had made eye contact with Franci the moment the train had pulled in. Now they were talking together, explaining their circumstances. His name was Bruno, and he came from northern Italy. Unable to chat for any length of time, since turns had to be taken, he asked her to come back to the window later, mentioning an idea. After her return from Petrovich, Silva had to get in on the fun and immediately struck up a love affair at first sight with a Roman named Flavio. They could hardly communicate, but just looked deeply into each other's eyes and sighed, Flavio, Silva, over and over again, a situation that quickly became boring to everyone else, particularly since it took place 20 yards apart and 40 feet above sea level. When Franci returned to the window, there was Bruno with a little package tied to a long laundry rope, which he started to swing parallel to the building until she was able to catch it. The system worked beautifully, and at least 50 girls acquired their Italian that night. The package Franci received contained a comb, a toothbrush, cigarettes, a pencil, a pair of socks, chocolate, paper, and a long letter. The feeling of being recognized as a woman was beautiful, especially since she felt anything but beautiful at the moment. She shared the letter and chocolate with her cousin Kitty. No sooner had they fallen asleep than an alert sounded and all hell broke loose. The night bombardment of Hamburg. Below them, 18-year-old Marion was kneeling, reciting one Ave Maria after the other. The night was disturbed again when a rat ran over Gertie's face. Rats were big, plentiful, and hungry, since there were now humans living where grain used to be stored. At 5, reveille sounded, and after putting on the overalls issued the night before and drinking some black coffee, the girls lined up in front of the building. Broken up into groups of 20 with 2 guards, they marched off toward another canal where they boarded a steamer. In contrast to Auschwitz, the guards were older members of the Wehrmacht, unfit for duty at the front. Some could be very unpleasant, but most were much less vicious than the SS men they had learned to fear. It was chilly on the boat early in the morning. From the water, one could see the devastation of this once beautiful city. Whole city blocks were only piles of rubble. Smoke rose to the sky from burning oil tanks after the bombardment of the preceding night. The lovely suburb of Blankenese gleamed untouched on the palisades of the river. The boat docked at an oil refinery called Erdöl, and here the work detail debarked. The prisoners were given shovels and assigned to clear the rubble from the air attacks into huge piles and to report any unfamiliar object. Russian POWs would be called to deal with it in case it was an unexploded shell. The refinery was still working, even though many of the buildings and tanks were in ruins. There were slave laborers of every nationality of occupied Europe everywhere, mainly French POWs, but also Russians who were in the most pitiful state, obviously starving and dressed in the torn rags that had once been their uniforms. They were too downtrodden to communicate with anyone, and their guards also treated them with exceptional cruelty. Communication with the French was established when the guards looked the other way or in the latrines. The French POWs understood the situation right away and were also not afraid to take risks to help, whereas the civilian laborers trembled before anyone in a German uniform. The German workers ignored everybody, making it their business to look the other way when faced with a group of foreigners or prisoners. The work was hard, and harder still for women who had never held a shovel in their hands before. It took days to learn the trick of swinging a full shovel up onto a truck, and some never learned. Picking up and loading broken bricks was not any easier. A chain was formed from pile to truck, with the shards of bricks passed from hand to hand, and after an hour, everyone's hands were bleeding. Relief came at noon when a truck from the German People's Welfare drove up with barrels of thick turnip and potato soup. It tasted vile, but was hot and filling. By comparison with Auschwitz, a vast improvement. At 6 p.m., the whistle sounded, and a very tired column of women shuttled back to the boat for the return trip. At Dessauer Ufer, they stood on line for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, then collapsed on their bunks. But Bruno and his friends were already waiting at their windows. This time he threw over a sweater after watching Franci shiver at Appel that morning. She wrote him a letter thanking him for his gifts and his proposal, but told him that she was already married. It was a risk to tell the truth. It could have ended Bruno's much needed help, but the sincerity of his letter that proposed marriage to her after the war left her no alternative. He took the news philosophically, resolved to treat her like a sister, and a very strong friendship developed. The bombardment of the first night repeated itself every other night, with the difference that now, at the sound of the sirens, the women were chased out of their bunks and herded into the cellar, which served as an air raid shelter. It slanted toward the water, and since the canal rose and fell with the tides, it was often half submerged in water. It was cold there, and they sat shivering in total darkness with rats scampering over their legs. They were more uneasy than they had been upstairs at the thought of how to get out in case of a direct hit. The two cousins hated the cellar and whenever possible hid under their bunk. Lack of sleep made everyone grouchy, and all remnants of courtesy and consideration fell by the wayside. A month after their arrival, Franci was hanging out of the window when a powerful slap interrupted her conversation with Bruno. She turned around and stared straight into Petrovich's eyes. Pulling her down, he pulled out his revolver and started shooting at the Italians. He could not do much harm, but the event put an end to a marvelous mail service. Oddly enough, there were no other repercussions except for a stern lecture on the propriety of conduct for young ladies. By September 1944, rumor had it that they would be moved. Petrovich received orders to report to the front. The Italians were to be given civilian status and integrated into the foreign labor force. Parting was sad. The boys provided their Czech friends with whatever they could spare and promised to stay in touch if they could discover where the girls were being taken. When they lined up to leave, the girls were all carrying bundles, although they had arrived 4 months earlier, practically naked. Musing about this phenomenon, Petrovich stopped Franci and pulling some cigarettes out of her pocket asked, "Where would these come from?" "I find them, Hauptscharführer," she answered. "You do? Where?" "Every day in the same place, Hauptscharführer." He shook his head, replaced the cigarettes, and walked on. Loaded on trucks, the girls were taken to Neuengammer, a suburb of Hamburg, some 15 miles away. That's it.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for reading that part of the book. It's the part that takes place in Dessauer Ufer. And I think a lot of topics that you mentioned before we can see in this chapter, like the contact she has to the Italian prisoners of war and how the women also had the possibility to get food, but also letters and the feeling of being recognized as a woman again. And I think this is really connected to what she is writing about before, because Dessauer Ufer was the first place that she was brought to by the SS after she was in Auschwitz. And she also often compares the place to Auschwitz.
Right. I wanted to say another reason maybe that the book was not received well by American publishers is my mother's sense of humor. When I read this, I realized she has this fantastic sense of humor. And in 1974, no one made jokes about the Holocaust or about Nazis or about Holocaust survivors. And she did. Her sense of humor is there in the whole book.
And as you read it, maybe people noticed that she is writing about herself in the third person. There's this one part that really impressed me touched me when I read the book. And this is when she is early in the story, when she is in Auschwitz with her cousin Kitty. And Kitty tells her that the SS is killing people with gas in Auschwitz. And from that point on, she's no longer using the first person to talk about or to tell the story, but she's switching to the third person. And she's also not using her name, Franci, but she's using the number she was given by the SS. When you read the book or now edited the book, did you have an idea why she did this change in the narrative, in the way she's telling the story?
Yeah, I think I've studied a lot about trauma. And one of the things that, one of the phenomena that happen in traumatized people is that they dissociate. They split, and one part of them is conscious of what is happening, and the other part observes what is happening. And I think that when Kitty told her that human beings were being gassed, she split, and she describes it very physically. She says she looked at her arm, and the tattoo became two tattoos, the arm became two arms, and she became two people, one who was living there and one who was watching the other one. And I don't think my mother thought of it as a literary device. I think she thought of it as a description of what happened to her, which is very interesting to me because, of course, a literary scholar sees it as a literary device, but I don't think that's correct.
Thank you. Before we open the discussion, I just saw for a minute that there was already a question for this topic, so I thought maybe we can ask it right away from someone in the audience. And they asked, in the excerpt, you replaced A4116 with Franci's name. Was this a conscious choice, or did you just do it to be more clear for people that didn't know the book? I am asking because I found the style very moving and I cried when she used I for the first time again. So if it was a conscious choice, I would be interested in your reasoning. Thank you. So if you would like to answer that, I think people are interested in that.
Yeah, I adapted the book, the chapter to read here because it would be too confusing to use the number without knowing how she got the number and what number it was. So when I read from her book, I often simplify the narrative.
Okay, so but this was the point where we thought we could open our conversation to the people in the Zoom. So everybody now is invited to ask questions. Questions you want to ask Helen. You can also write these questions in German and we will translate it. I will say that in German. Also Sie und ihr können jetzt sehr gerne Fragen stellen in dem Zoom-Chat und wir werden die Fragen auch übersetzen, wenn Sie die Frage lieber auf Deutsch stellen wollen. Okay, are there already questions here?
I can already see questions coming in, and just a short technical explanation as well. We are recording this event because we would like to publish it later, maybe for our initiative, and a friend of ours who's a filmmaker is also filming, so if you see someone in the background with a camera, don't be surprised, but you won't be seen, don't worry. So, all right, we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm just starting. Someone wants to know, did you know if your mother ever spoke to Bruno after the war?
I don't know. I wish I knew. I understand that he came from Treviso, which is really interesting because my great-grandmother grew up in a town in the Czech Bohemian Islands, which was owned by a count from Treviso. So Treviso, Italy, is a place that runs through my family history. I would love to find Bruno's family. If you read the book, you will see that he was one of, I believe, 11 children. So I'm sure that there must be some descendants of this man living in Treviso. And my idea as a journalist was to try and get some Italian friends of mine to write to the newspaper in Treviso and advertise for this family of an Italian POW who was in Neuengammer during the war, who knew this Czech Jewish woman. But and a friend of mine did write to a newspaper in Treviso, but they didn't receive any response. And then COVID happened, so I kind of dropped the whole thing. But if anybody is interested in this, I would urge them to pursue it, because I would love to find his family.
Wow, thank you. I think that is actually very interesting for our initiative as well, because we're also doing research on the prisoner of war, which means actually POW, in case anyone doesn't know, who were imprisoned in Lagerhaus G at Dessauer Ufer. So that's very interesting for us to know. I think we would also love to find more about this, although I can't promise that we succeed. But yeah, there are even more questions which relate to your mother and what happened after the war. Because someone also asked, do you know if your mother ever returned to Hamburg and the Dessauer Ufer or any of the other locations she was imprisoned at?
Yes, I can tell you that. Unlike many immigrants to America who became rich, my parents became very poor because my father did not speak any English. He was 42 years old and he was unemployed for 10 years. So what my mother did for the first 10 years after the war, after 1948, when we came to America, was she worked very hard to support our family. She was what in English is called the breadwinner of the family. And so she had no time to do anything, and they certainly had no money to travel to Europe. Again, big difference between the 1960s and the 1970s and now. It was very expensive to travel. It was expensive to travel to Europe. And the first place I think she would have wanted to go would have been to Prague to see her cousin Kitty, because after the Second World War, there was the Cold War and there was the Iron Curtain, and they couldn't even write to each other without censorship. So in the 1960s, my mother received some reparations from the German government. And the first thing she did with the money, it wasn't very much money, but the first thing she did was to go to Prague. She flew to Prague and she saw Kitty, which was the most important thing. Then she flew to Israel, where she saw somebody else who she was in concentration camp with, actually a German Jew, Margot Kerbel, who was in Theresienstadt with her. And she did not go to Hamburg. She did not go to Auschwitz. She certainly did not go to Belsen. I don't think that it was a question of whether she wanted to or not. We still didn't have very much money. And she could only go to, it was already a stretch to go to Prague and to Israel. And also remember, she was working. She was the principal breadwinner of the family. So she basically took 2 weeks off, did these two things, and went back to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine that. And there's another question which is also relating to a similar time or period of time. Someone is asking, your book, Children of the Holocaust, was originally published in 1979, a few years after your mother wrote her memoir. How did you think it influenced or inspired each other in your writing process? And if so, how?
Good question. I think I have to broaden the question to a larger issue, which is that my mother always talked about the war and her experiences during the war. My mother was very close to me. I am the only daughter in the family. I have 2 brothers. And also we have very similar tastes. We both like music, we both like literature, we both like writing, we both like theater. And so I was really her confidant. And everything that is in the book, I already knew. She had told me many times. I had met many of the people in the book. In 1968, when I was in Prague and the Soviets invaded, it was Kitty who took me to the train, to the evacuation train, and took me out of Czechoslovakia in 1968. I met Margot the second woman she visited, in Israel when I was a student. I used to spend my weekends at Margot's house. So this whole story that readers read in my mother's memoir, In Franci's War, was part of my life. I knew all of this stuff. I didn't have to read the manuscript. In fact, I think one of the reasons I didn't recognize how important the manuscript was as source material was because it wasn't news to me. I knew all of it. It was, in English we say, it was old hat. It was not new. It was not revelatory for me. So I think that the manuscript itself did not influence my work. My mother and her stories all her life influenced my work. And also my father was a very different kind of person. My father was an athlete. Actually, he played in the Berlin Olympics of 1936. He represented Czechoslovakia in water polo. And I'm now working on an exhibit in a regional museum in the Czech Republic that focuses on his life and work. But even though he was a world or certainly a national athletic star, he could not find work in America because in New York City, nobody played water polo. You know, Manhattan is not exactly conducive to swimming pools. So she really was the primary person about the past in my life. But my father also had a kind of different perspective on many of the things she described. My father was also in Terezin, also in Auschwitz, and also in work camp, but not in Neuengammer. He was further east. So I would say my parents' experience of the war tremendously influenced my life and my work, but the manuscript itself, not so much.
So you've mentioned the exhibition in Czechoslovakia, which is going to happen. And there's actually a question from Prague, or a greetings from Prague coming in from Angelika Ritter. And she says, good evening, greetings from Prague. I'm thrilled to join this event tonight. What a coincidence. We, as the Goethe Institute in Prague, adopted the Stolpersteine that mark your family's former home there. And my question is, when are you visiting Prague? Myself and all of us of the Goethe Institute very much would like to meet you, Angelika.
I'm so delighted that the Goethe Institute adopted the Stolpersteine. And I want to talk about a little bit about this wonderful idea of the Stolpersteine, which everybody online might not know about. The Stolpersteine are stumbling stones. They're little stones that are the size and the shape of cobblestones. And of course, in Prague, there are many, many places where there are still cobblestones. And as it turns out, this is so fortunate. The place where my mother and grandmother lived and had their salon, on the first floor now, there is a huge antiquariat and bookstore. And so these three Stolpersteine for my mother and for her parents are right in front of a bookstore. And this bookstore is a great bookstore, and I'm sure they're going to be selling my mother's book next week. So it's amazing, and it's great that the Goethe Institute adopted these stones. And it's wonderful, this art project of public memorial art that was originated by the German artist. I can't remember his name right now. I'm so embarrassed.
Gunter Demnig? Oh, he's the guy who does it. Yeah.
Yes. So it's just wonderful that he had this idea many years ago. And I should say these stumbling stones memorialize not only Jews, but also Roma people, and also the children who were not healthy, who were sent away to concentration camps. And in fact, my father's younger brother was emotionally disabled, and he was immediately killed upon reaching the concentration camps.
Oh, I didn't know that. And but speaking of Prague, someone else is asking, Anna, you said that former clients of your mother kept some of her things in Prague after she was deported. Did she get them back when she went to Prague again? And if so, how was their reunion or the meeting again?
I think the reunions were very mixed. On the one extreme, one of the clients of her mother tried to adopt her, even though she was 25 years old, and wanted legally to be her parent. On the other hand, some people who she had left her things with, clothing with, this was not a client, this was a friend of the family, refused to give them back and seemed not to recognize that the clothing had ever belonged to her. So it was very, very mixed. I can't put a number on it. I don't know what % of people were very accommodating and how many were not, but it was a mixed reception.
So I think we have 3 more questions, and I think we should come to an end slowly. So I think we can take these, and if anyone wants to send in something really urgent, they can do so now, but I think like 3 to 5 more would be fine. So
I also have some questions.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to go first, or should I? Okay. So Thomas is asking, there are numerous testimonies by the Jewish female prisoners of Dessauer Ufer, but only a few by the male prisoners imprisoned later, who came from a lot of different countries but were not Jewish. Do you think there are more testimonies because the women were Jews or because they were women?
I really don't know. I think if you look at survivor testimonies in general, you will find that there are all, I don't know the percentages. You would have to ask a scholar this question, but it would be an interesting work. It would be interesting scholarly work to look at the entire universe of Holocaust memoirs in all the different countries and see what % are women, what % are men. I bet that they would differ by nationality. I think, for example, in Israel, most of the memoirs, the majority would be by men, but that's a guess. That would be my hypothesis. In France, I think a lot of the memoirs were written by women. But again, it's my guess. Somebody needs to do the research.
So maybe you want to ask some of you? Okay. So Nicola is asking or saying, this is such an important book. Thank you so much, Helen, for your amazing presentation. It would be important if Franci's work published in Germany. Can anyone suggest a publisher? And I'd suggest that you use the chat, or that you, if anyone knows anything, that you just put it in here, and then maybe you can like copy it and keep it. But yeah, just wanted to give you the praise as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and someone else is asking, I am very much looking forward to reading your mother's book. I had a question concerning the interviews you did for your book about the children of the Holocaust. Are these interviews available somewhere in an archive maybe? I think they might be interesting oral sources for researchers.
I would love to give all of my papers, everything, the letters I received, my interviews, my notes from my books, to anybody who wants them. So if you can suggest in the chat an archive or a university to which I can donate all of this stuff and photos, I would be most obliged.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a treasure which can be lifted. I don't know. Wow, that's really interesting to hear. And there's an information as well from Holger Artus. He lives in Hamburg, and he researches about the Italian military internees, like the prisoners of war. And he says that his research shows that there were 8 Brunos imprisoned in Lagerhaus G. So there's currently, I can say that much, there's currently a project group which is researching the history of an Italian military internees in Hamburg. And I believe if we find out more about Bruno, we will absolutely let you know.
Well, we know that he was blonde, and we know that he came from Treviso, and we know that he came from a family of 11 children.
That is something to start, I guess. Well, and then there are 2 more questions. Someone wants to know, you mentioned that your parents spoke Czech at home, but being part of Czechoslovakia was a huge part of their identity before the war. Did that change when they were living in the USA?
Did it change after they were living in the USA? Well, I suppose, yes, but they did return to Prague after the war. Many Jews could not or would not return to the places where they had grown up, especially in Poland, some in Hungary. My parents went back to Prague and they reestablished their lives in Prague. My father's teammates elected him to the Czechoslovak National Olympic Committee. So from 1945 to 1948, he was a member of the Czechoslovak National Olympic Committee, and he resumed his career as a water polo coach. My mother reestablished her salon, and they were actually, those of you who know Prague, if you know Wenceslas Square, when you're looking up at the museum, on the left side, there's a very nice building, an apartment building called the Koruna, where the cafeteria is. And that's where we lived. We lived on the first floor above the ground floor. And that's where I was born. That's where I spent the first months of my life. And so they were very much identified with Czechoslovakia. They wanted to remain in Czechoslovakia, and they would never have left if it had not been for the communist takeover. My father thought the communists were Nazis in a different color uniform. And in his famous words, he said, "I am leaving in a bathing suit if necessary." My mother did not want to leave. She was a leftist and she was sympathetic to the communists. And they had a huge fight after the demonstrations in Prague. And for the only time in his life, my father slapped her. And she was very offended and she went outside. It was February 1948, and she walked around the block. And when she came back, she said, "Okay, we're gonna emigrate." And so they came to America in 1948. Like many Europeans, they found America very, very conservative. They were very shocked by the discrimination against African Americans, who were then called Negroes. They were also shocked by the anti-Semitism they saw. They were shocked by many, many things. But over the years, I think they became quite fond of America. But my mother never lost her love for Prague and or for Kitty, and the two of them corresponded until she died.
That's nice to hear. So two more things here. So Aline from Neuengammer, Aline Bessmann, who works there, says that she will check our suggestion or their suggestions about Bruno with the archival material in Neuengammer. And sends you warmest wishes. And so there's one last question in the chat right now, which relates to the future use of Lagerhaus G. And I wanted to take this to the end because I thought we should stay with you and your mother's story and your story first. And the person is saying there is a huge discussion in Hamburg about the future and the use of the Lagerhaus G, where the satellite camp Dessauer Ufer was located. What are your thoughts and wishes about the future use of Lagerhaus G?
Well, of course, I'm sitting here in Boston, so I really don't know the specifics of your situation. However, I can talk about historical preservation in general and memorialization in general. The problem of preserving historical buildings is universal. It's here in Boston, it's in New York City, it's everywhere. And the problem of memorializing the war is also a problem everywhere in Europe and in even here in the United States. And the third problem, which is a problem for everybody everywhere, is housing, is affordable housing. We have that problem in America everywhere, and I'm sure you have it in Europe everywhere as well. And so one of the things that interests me a lot is a notion called adaptive reuse, which means you take old historic buildings and you adapt their use to current needs. And if the current need is low-income housing and memorialization and communal space, it seems to me that Lagerhaus G is a perfect place to accomplish all of those things. You can have low-income housing, you can have a communal space, and you can have a memorial. And it's very nice that you have all of this literature that describes this place, because you can have exhibits. And I think what's really great about and unusual about this space is that there were so many women there. It was, I believe, as far as I know, one of the only places to house this number of women in one place. And many of them wrote about it. So there's a great deal of information about it. So I very much like the idea of the two of you being the face of this initiative. And I like working with young women in bringing something like this project to fruition.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Helen. The question you just answered was also one of my questions. So I thought I have to ask you what you think about the future of Lagerhaus G, but now it already was a question in the chat. So I still have one question. So we talked about your books and your mother's book that you just published, and I was wondering if you have any new projects, if you're planning to maybe write a new book, if you have a new topic, and if you maybe want us to tell us what this could be.
Well, actually, the project that I'm working on now, which is really wonderful because I've never spent a lot of time on my father's history, is this exhibition that's going to be in Rodnice, which in German is called the Raudnitz. And it's on the Elbe. My father started his swimming career in the Elbe. He swam in the river when he was a child. And the house in which his family lived and that my grandfather built is now the regional museum of the area. And so we started working on this about 2 years ago also. And because of COVID, it was postponed several times. But actually today, I got the posters for the exhibit. So I'm very excited about this. And I really hope that by the fall, I'll be able to travel and come to both Hamburg and to Rodnice to this exhibit. So I hope to see some of you then. And of course, once I get done with that, I think I'll be looking to write another book of my own.
Wow.
Yeah, we'll be happy to meet you in Hamburg in autumn.
Of course, definitely.
Okay, do you have another question, Lisa?
I don't think so.
Because I wrote a last question. Is there anything else you want to say, Helen? Is there anything you want to share? Is there anything that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm so delighted that you organized this. I really want to thank the museum for and the free room for making it available. I think it's a great idea. And I think the initiative is a great idea. And I'm just thrilled that we were able to connect and to do this. And I want to thank the Goethe Institute also for the Stolpersteine. And I look forward to seeing you all in person.
Oh, we'd love to do this.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and answering our questions and the questions from the chat. I hope you will have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you. And I'm sure we will hear from one another.
Yeah, I'm sure. And thanks for everyone for joining in tonight. And I think we're closing now.
Bye-bye.
Anyway, have a good night, have a good afternoon, whatever. Bye.
Ja, Wiederschauen.
Ciao.